Hello again, 122. In this video, we will do part 3, which will be the Meiji Restoration in 1868 in Japan. We'll talk about those political changes first. Then in part 4, the next video, we will talk about the Industrial Revolution then that occurs in Japan in the late 19th century. Finally, in part 5, we will conclude with why Japan became an imperialist nation. And in this particular photo here, we see Emperor Meiji, the Enlightened One, listening to some of the new intentions in a charter oath of 5 articles. And you can see the emperor over here listening to some of the different changes that are being promulgated by these people who overthrew the last shogun, and the Tokugawa period ends. Opening to the world, to the Western powers, Japan's refusal to open its doors to Western goods was an affront and a challenge. Convinced that the expansion of trade would benefit all nations, Western nations began to approach Japan in the hope of opening the kingdom to foreign interests, just as they did in China. And in 1853, the Americans, under Commodore Matthew C. Perry, arrived in Edo Bay, which is now Tokyo Bay, with a letter from President Millard Fillmore asking for the opening of formal relations between the two countries. The U.S. ships going across the Pacific have to stop in those years of limited fuel supplies. They have to get water and other fuel supplies periodically, otherwise they can't keep going. And that's what they view Japan as a stopping off point to refuel and then continue on to China. And Perry returns a few months later with a larger fleet, and he wants an answer. And in his absence, the Japanese officials hotly debated the issue. Some argued that contacts with the West would be politically and morally disadvantageous to Japan, while others pointed to the U.S. military superiority. They hadn't seen these ships, as we'll see in a few moments, and they recommended concessions. For the shogunate in Ito, which is today Tokyo, the black guns of Perry's ships proved decisive, and Japan agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa, which provided for the return of shipwrecked American sailors, the opening of 2 ports, and the establishment of a U.S. consulate in Japan. And this will go further in 1858. There will be further negotiations between Townsend Harris, an American representative, and even more ports will be opened up. And this is going to lead to resistance from southern territories of Setsumu and Choshu. They are the ones with strong samurai military traditions. In 1863, the Satchu alliance forced the hapless shogun to promise to end relations with the West. The shogun, though, eventually reneged on this agreement, and the rebels soon had their own problems. When the Choshu troops fired on Western ships in the Strait of Shimonoseki, the Westerners fired back and they destroyed the Choshu fortifications. And this incident reinforced in the Satchu the need to improve their military. Right then and there it begins in the 1860s. Now they demand that the emperor resigns because we have to do something about this military gap. We have to reform and we have to modernize. And in January of 1868, rebel armies attacked the shogun's palace in Kyoto and proclaimed the restored authority of the emperor. And here is the black ship of Commodore Perry and the Japanese going out to meet him. They were quite amazed, especially the smoke coming out of these stacks. They had never seen anything of that before. They are still using strictly wind power in the 1850s in Japan. And change is in the wind now for the Japanese. The symbol of the new era was a young emperor himself. He had taken the reign name Meiji, or enlightened rule, in ascending the throne in 1867. Although the post-Tokugawa period was termed a restoration, The Meiji ruler, who shared the Satcho group's newly adopted modernist outlook, this is a key idea here, he was controlled by the new leadership, just as the shogun had controlled his predecessors. Now there will be a transformation of Japanese politics. They will reform political, social, economic, and cultural institutions. Or will they? The key posts in the new government were dominated by the modernizing samurai, eventually known as the Genro, or the elder statesmen, from the Satcho clique. This is key. Eventually, there will be a couple of political parties that will form. The Liberal Party is still around today, ladies and gentlemen. It's been in power for much of the post-World War II period, and it is believing in the power of Parliament, or the Japanese Diet, as we'll see. That's their parliament, as a representative of the people, whereas the Progressive Party called for the distribution of power between a legislative and an executive branch, with the executive having more authority. And in this era, the progressives emerged victorious. The Meiji Constitution, which is finally adopted in 1890, was based on a Bismarckian or German model, Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Germany, with authority vested in an executive branch. And the imperialist faction was pacified by the statement that the Constitution was the gift of the emperor. And the Meiji oligarchs would handpick the emperor's cabinet. This is the real controlling group of the country. The upper house of parliament would be appointed and have equal legislative powers with the lower house, called the Diet, as I mentioned, and those members are popularly elected. And the core ideology of the state, called the Kokutai, or the national polity, embodied the concept of the uniqueness of the Japanese system based on the supreme authority of the emperor. And the ancient practice of Shinto was transformed into a virtual national religion. The result was a system that was democratic in form, but despotic in practice, because the cabinet really controls the country. It's modern in appearance, but still traditional in that power remains in the hands of that ruling oligarchy, the Satcho clique. Those samurai from the southern part of the country, they're still in control. And this permitted them to retain their influence and their economic power while acquiescing in the emergence of new institutions and values that are going to help to modernize the country. And then that leads into the Industrial Revolution now in Part 4, the Industrial Revolution of late 19th century Japan.